It's great to see everybody, and hello as well to the folks who are joining remotely online. So today's talk is about starting your company and starting it the right way. There's a lot of ways to think about entrepreneurship. There's a lot of ways to think about starting a company, and we really want to make sure that it's done correctly the first time, because as we'll see, this is a scenario where an ounce of prevention can be worth a pound of cure. So brief note about myself and my firm. So as Cassandra mentioned, my name is Josh Hayes. I'm a partner at a law firm based here in RTP called Hutchison PLLC. Some of you may know us as Hutch Law. We are focused on working almost exclusively with early stage entrepreneurs, particularly those in the tech and the life sciences, but we have broader skill set, broader applications as well. I like to say that we help clients get formed, funded, and sold. So we're really there to help support you through all stages of your company's life cycle. And one of the nice things about working in a firm like ours is we have specialist resources as well. So if you're someone who has a tax question, if you have an employment law question, if you're interested in things like data privacy or generative AI, which is a really hot topic right now, we have resources and support for you as well. And I like to think that we're more than just attorneys. We're in the boat with you. We like to think of ourselves as business partners, kind of rowing the ship alongside you. So today we're going to talk about three main topics. First, we're going to talk about entity formation and choice of entity. This is going to be most relevant for those of you who are thinking about entrepreneurship, maybe pretty early in your entrepreneurial journey, but haven't taken the step to form a legal entity. This is going to help you decide whether it's more appropriate, for example, for you to form as an LLC, a limited liability company, or a corporation, because there's costs and benefits to forming as either one of those types of entities. And then the second topic is going to be really around building a team and good governance. So once you have your entity formed, how do you run the company, and how do you run it in a way that's compliant and in a way that facilitates future success? By the way, if you have any questions, feel free to raise your hand. I'm happy to take questions and make this more of a discussion format at any time throughout the presentation, although we will hopefully have a few minutes at the end of the presentation for questions as well. So let's start with entity formation. A really fundamental question here that you may be asking is, do I really need an entity? Can't I just start my company, make my widgets, or offer my services and start providing them to the public? Well, you could, but there's a lot of risks in doing so. The default rule is that you're what's called a sole proprietor. That's if you're the only person working in a particular business, or if there's multiple people working on a particular venture, you would be considered a partnership. That's if you don't have any separate legal entity formed and in place. Now, there's several benefits to forming a legal entity around your business and not just operating as a sole proprietor or a partnership. The first benefit here is really the most important, and that's about personal liability protection. Okay, so if you're a sole proprietor and you're making a product and you're selling it into the stream of commerce, you're selling it to customers, and that product, let's say, makes somebody sick or harms them or their business in some way, then it's really important for you to understand that not only the company's assets, so the company's bank account, company's car, et cetera, are at risk, your personal assets are at risk as well. So if somebody has a claim against you and you haven't formed a separate entity, then they can come after your house, they can come after your personal bank accounts, your car, any personal assets you have are at risk. And if you form an entity and you manage that entity in a compliant way, then there's actually a shield around that entity that separates the assets of that company from the assets that you hold personally. And so if somebody has a claim against you and you set up a separate entity and you're managing it correctly, then they can make a claim against the assets of the company, and those company assets are at risk, but your personal assets are safe. Yes, I see a question back there.
If you throw all your assets in a trust, is that also protected? Or does the trust not protect you through such funds?
So the question is, if you have your assets in a trust, does that sort of protect you in the same way that having, or in a similar way to having a legal entity in place? And the answer to that is there are some legal protections that having a trust affords, but if you don't have a legal entity in place for your business, then that person who has a claim against you could make a claim against you individually, as well as a claim against your trust. So it's not sort of a protection in that way for commercial matters. But good question. So a second important consideration when you're starting a business is if you're developing intellectual property. And that's a little bit outside the scope as to exactly what intellectual property means. But a short working definition is any property of the business that isn't tangible, isn't something that you can hold. Things like your business plan, your formulas, your customer lists, trade secrets, things like that. You want to make sure that any of that gets transferred appropriately and correctly over to your business. And that's particularly if you're going to be taking on outside money for your business, which we'll talk about in a second. The third reason to start a company is that it creates certainty in dealing with third parties. So if you're dealing with large companies in the triangle or national companies, they get a lot more comfortable with dealing with you and have a lot more confidence in dealing with you if they're dealing with a legal entity rather than dealing with you individually. Right now, you may be the only person associated with your LLC, but it looks more professional and it gives the other party more confidence if they're dealing with an entity rather than just an individual party. So part of it is a professionalism aspect as well. And then the last point I want to make is if you are a business that's looking to take on outside funding, so you think of startups, you think of Silicon Valley, most of those businesses are not profitable. So what they do is they take on outside capital so that they can build their product and hopefully get to profitability at a later date. If you're that type of business that's thinking about taking outside capital, you need to have an entity in place because no investor is going to write you a check personally. They're going to only write a check to your company. And by the way, it's the same if you're looking to take grants from the government. There's grants called SBIR and STTR grants for those grants are only available to companies that have officially formed a separate legal entity. So hopefully I've convinced you that having an entity is needed in your case if you're looking to start a business. So then the question becomes, okay, Josh, what type of entity should I form? It's largely a tax-driven choice, which we'll get into, but there's two main options. You may hear some other things like limited partnership, S-corp, things like that. But for our purposes, you're probably going to be in one of two lanes. You're probably either going to be going down the LLC path, limited liability company path, or the path of a corporation. So just a quick vocabulary tutorial, so we're all speaking the same language here. When I talk about corporations, I'll be talking about things like articles of incorporation, certificate of incorporation, might call that a charter. These have bylaws. Those are sort of your governing documents that dictate how meetings of the directors and stockholders take place. It's important to note that a corporation has stockholders, sometimes shareholders, and ownership is expressed in terms of shares or stock. When we get into the governance section of the talk, I'll be talking in sort of corporate terms, but the concepts are really substantially similar and analogous for LLCs as well. But when we talk about LLCs, they don't have bylaws. They have what's called an operating agreement. They don't have articles of incorporation. They have articles of organization. They don't have stockholders. They have what are called members. And generally, when we talk about expressing ownership in an LLC, we're talking about membership interest or ownership interest as opposed to stock. So quick vocabulary primer there. let's talk a little bit about LLCs. LLC stands for Limited Liability Company. It does provide that liability protection. LLCs have one layer of tax. So what that means is that the LLC is not a separate taxpayer. It doesn't pay taxes to the US government or any state government. Those gains or losses flow through to the individual owner. So there's one layer of tax. You don't need to know for purposes of this discussion exactly how that works, but the important thing to know is that LLCs have one layer of tax. So generally more tax efficient to pull money, to pull cash out of a business when there's one layer of tax. What are the benefits of an LLC? Well, they're very flexible, particularly for people who are thinking about starting a solo business, for like a consulting firm, consulting business. An LLC can be really helpful because you have a lot of flexibility, a lot of freedom to determine how you want to structure the relationship between you and your co-founders. They're easy to form, generally cheaper to form an LLC than a C corporation. And another good thing about them is that unlike corporations, which are largely defined by statute, by the laws passed by the various states, you can define the contours of your company by the contracts that you enter into with your co-founders, with your customers, and with your vendors. And so that level of flexibility can be really helpful for some people. Now, you'll note that I put creature of contract as a con as well. And the reason for that is, if you don't have an agreement in place and you're just sort of operating on, let's say, good faith or on trust with your partners, then judges don't really have a lot to go on to help step in and say, well, you're not operating that properly because the only thing that they have to go on are the contracts that you actually entered into. So if you don't enter into a contract, or if you enter into a contract that, you know, maybe you wrote yourselves, it's on the back of a napkin, it's not really well considered or thought out, that's all that a judge can really look at. They don't really have a body of statutes and laws, and there's actually not much case law, or not as much case law to draw on. And so you really have to be thoughtful about the contracts that you prepare. And that's why if you've ever seen an LLC operating agreement, it's very, very long and complicated. It's a very long and complicated document because everything that governs the rights of the parties has to be in there. Equity compensation is more difficult. So if you ever think about startups or giving co-founders equity in your company as opposed to, or in addition to cash, that's tougher in an LLC. It's a lot easier to do that in a corporation. And then if you are looking to take on outside capital, if you are looking to raise money, most investors are going to require that you convert from an LLC into a corporation prior to writing you a check. So those are some drawbacks of the LLC form, but there are some benefits as well. Talking about corporations, so like LLCs, they also provide that limited liability. There's sort of two forms, or C Corp or S Corp. That's really a tax designation. For state law purposes, you're just a corporation. Unlike LLCs, there's two layers of tax. So again, if there's one thing you kind of take home about the taxes relative to LLCs and corporations, the thing to note is that LLCs have one layer, C corporations have two layers. What that means is that the C corporation actually pays taxes at the entity level. So it has an EIN, it files corporate tax returns, and then let's say you wanted to pull cash out of your corporation, give it to your owners, it gets taxed again. So that's something that you want to think about depending on how you want to run your business, because that can be kind of inefficient from a tax perspective to get taxed once at the corporate level and then twice when you pull the money out of the business as an owner. There's no restrictions on who can be an owner in a C Corp. So you can have entities, trusts, you can have individuals, both foreign and domestic. You can have different classes of stock. So you can have voting, non-voting stock. You can have stock with all sorts of bells and whistles, which is what investors like to see. And has a well-understood governance structure. So whether you're operating as a Delaware LLC or an NC LLC, the judges have a really well-established body of case law to guide them if something goes off the rails. So if there's a dispute with a co-founder, a customer, courts have a lot of really good guidance to help navigate those situations. And then lastly, as sort of alluded to, if you're looking to raise money, outside capital, a C corporation is really the preferred vehicle. I will briefly mention S corporations. So S corporations also have that one layer of tax, just like an LLC, but there's a lot of restrictions on who can own an S corporation. So what we usually say is if you're thinking about maybe a solo consulting business and you're thinking about an LLC, it's probably worth a quick conversation with your accountant to see if an S corp might be right for you. But you have to be aware of these restrictions, right? So if you have an S corporation and let's say you try to transfer your ownership in that S corp to a trust, that could invalidate your S election. You're no longer an S corp from the IRS's perspective. You're now a C corp because you essentially blown your S election by violating one of these requirements. And that's not just a theoretical risk. I'm actually dealing with that exact issue with a company right now. And basically they last year didn't engage legal counsel. They transferred stock to an LLC and an S corp, which blew their S election. And that's going to be very, very costly for them to fix. There's not really a good outcome for them, unfortunately. So C versus S, which is more common? You know, C corporations by far are more common than S corps. But again, if you're thinking about, again, sort of a service-based or a consulting-based company, then an S corp could be right for you. We'd recommend talking to your accountants on that one. Briefly going to mention this. I'm not going to go through this line by line, but I mentioned that institutional investors, so people who may want to invest in your company, really like C corporations. Now, why is that, right? Like it's tax inefficient. There are those two layers of tax. You know, why are they so interested in C corps? The reason is right here. So very, very briefly, what this says is that if you're a certain type of corporation, so let's say a SaaS company, a software company, or a biotech company, some company that's selling goods in the marketplace, and you get stock directly from the corporation, and you hold that stock for at least 3 years. Most of the time, when you sell stock in a company, you get taxed on what's called the gain. In other words, if you paid a penny for your stock, you sell it for $1, the government's going to tax you based on the spread between what you bought it for and what you sold it for. But with this part of the tax code, IRC 1202, you actually get to exclude a portion of your sales proceeds from tax, from income tax. And that can be up to, by the way, $15 million, right? So if you sell your company, the first $15 million could be excludable from income tax. So that's an extraordinary remedy. That's one of the things that investors really look at closely when they're investing in companies. And that's something to think about as a founder as well. So tale of two companies. Let's help you guys decide whether it makes sense to be a C corp or an LLC. Option A. There's sort of tale of two founders here. Option A. I'd like to grow my company quickly. I'm thinking about Silicon Valley startups here. I'm going to take on outside capital from my investors to help scale. And my ultimate goal is to sell my company. So I'm going to be living off ramen noodles for a couple of years because I'm not going to be taking cash out of the business. I'm going to be putting all the cash back into the business so that I can grow it as quick as possible. And then when I sell, that's going to be my big payout. That's option A. Option B. I'd like to grow my company more through sales, right? So I'm not sort of trying to grow it as fast as I can, take on all this outside money. I just want to build something, sell it to people, and keep that business alive as long as I can, right? Maybe I'll sell it, maybe not. It's not really a focus of mine right now. Option A is what we call a startup model. Those are a lot of what the companies out in the Bay Area, Silicon Valley, that's sort of what they're trying to accomplish and achieve. And a corporation is going to be a better fit for them. Option B is what we call usually a small business or sometimes a lifestyle company model. And an LLC is probably going to be a better fit for you there. So before we pivot away from choice of entity, are there any questions? Yes.
I'm curious where you would put like an independent research institute as an entity. More interested in doing like policy work or broad research and design.
So I guess the question to you would be, are you looking to sell something to a customer at some point? So conduct research with the ultimate goal of selling it? Or is this more of a sort of pure research endeavor and you're going to publish the results in like more of an academic context or maybe a open source type context?
I would see it as facilitating the former.
Okay, so you're doing research, but ultimately the goal is to, sell that research to other third parties. So I think, in that case, I see that as kind of a service-based business, right? And I think an LLC could be appropriate. Now, if you find yourself after working on that for a couple of years that maybe there's some sort of product or data set that you could commercialize and look to get investors to invest in your company so that you could scale that and kind of grow in that way, I think it probably makes sense to start as an LLC in that context. Because you can always convert to a C Corp later on. Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. All right, so we're going to talk now about governance. This is, yes.
Can you also convert from a corporation to the LLC, or
Good question. So the question is, so I just mentioned that you can convert from an LLC to a corporation. The question is, can you convert from a corporation to an LLC? The answer is technically yes, but it can be painful. So when you convert from an LLC to a corporation, that's usually, my tax partner's in my ear making me say usually, a tax-free conversion. With a conversion from a C Corp to an LLC, that's always going to be taxable. They basically treat that as if you've liquidated the C Corporation and then started a new LLC. So that you can't get from here to there without paying tax. So it is possible, but it's not in most cases efficient. Any other questions? All right. Yes.
So let's say you go from a corporation to an LLC, but you don't have much in, you're basically making a loss at this point.
Mm-hmm.
So then would they tax the loss or they tax the revenue?
So that's a good question. That's waiting a little.
Like a generic response. But...
Yeah. So generally speaking, you're taxed on sort of profits.
Gotcha.
And so the exact scenario is going to depend on your particular situation. But yeah, I mean, the amount of tax may not be particularly significant if you're sort of just getting started. But the thing to note is that you can't get from corporation from an LLC totally tax-free. Yeah. So we're going to talk about governance. We're going to talk about governance for stockholders, directors, officers, and advisors. So these are key people. As a solo entrepreneur, you're going to be wearing all of those hats, but you're still going to be making the same decisions that you would whole team around you. And so it's important to understand, okay, am I making this decision as a founder? Am I making this decision as a director? Am I making it as CEO of my company? Because those have different ramifications because you're doing you can contribute something and you've gotten stock in return. So that's a stockholder. Board of directors. So the stockholders as owners appoint a board of directors to help manage and govern the company. Every corporation shares of stock and I get 30 shares of stock, it's important to think about it in terms of percentages, right? It's important to think about it as, well, I'm a 60% owner and you're a 40% owner. Why is that important? Because a majority tends to rule in these scenarios, right? So if you have 51% of the stock of a company, you can make a lot of key decisions that somebody who holds 39% or less can't make, right? And so it's important to understand, like, if you're bringing on 2 co-founders and you make things 50-50, that's often a really good idea in theory, but it can also make things really difficult if the founders don't agree, because you've essentially set up a business where you need both parties to agree on every single decision. Again, not to say you can't do it, and sometimes that is the right answer, but it's also important to think about, are both parties truly equally committed to the business, or is, somebody working on this on the side? Are they working on it full time now, but also applying for jobs? And what happens if they get another sort of job where they can take a paycheck and this becomes a backseat priority? It's important to think through these issues on the front end, because it's really, really difficult to tease those apart once, the founders are no longer seeing eye to eye or on the same page. There's also a note there about beware of talking about percentages after you form the company. And what do I mean by that? So if I say, I'm going to give you 10% of my business, and then I go on for a couple of years, maybe I've given 20% to somebody else, maybe I've given 30% to someone else, maybe I've issued 1 million more shares of stock, right? Now, when I issue more stock like that, my interest gets diluted, right? So if I had 70% of a business and I issue, and 1 million shares are outstanding, I issue 1 million more shares, my interest went from 70 to 35%. But if I don't have anything in writing and I just told you I was going to give you 10%, 10% as of when, right? 10% when I hold 70 or 10% when I hold 35? I know what he's going to say. It's probably the opposite of what I'm going to say, right? So it's important to make sure that you understand, like, when you're giving out equity and you talk in terms of percentages, it's as of when, right? As of the date that it's being granted, as of a particular date certain. You don't want to sort of leave those as loose ends for the parties to kind of argue about later. I'm going to make a brief note about vesting. So you remember I was talking about how there's certain scenarios where both parties are equally invested in the business at the outset, and then one of them starts to have different priorities later on. Vesting is the way that you can kind of account for and address that. What that means is that you have to provide services for the company over time, usually over the next 2 to 4 years, in order to, quote, earn all of your shares. So let's say your stock's vesting over 4 years, 25% a year. You and I, we have 1 million shares each. I decide to leave after year 1. That's not really fair to you, right? Because we would still be 50-50, but you're now doing all the work. What vesting does is says, okay, I was vesting over 4 years. I should get credit for that first year, but I shouldn't get credit for the 3 years that I told you I was going to help out and I didn't. So I'm going to keep 25% of what I originally got. The rest I'm going to give back to the company. So that's how vesting works. It's important to think through these kind of things at the outset as owners. Yes.
Is the length of the vesting determined by other variables?
Yeah, good question. The question is, how do we determine the length of the vesting? And the answer to that is, it really is sort of a negotiation of the parties depending on your particular situation. So if you were to say, well, these next 2 years are critical, and if we go our separate ways after those 2 years, we'll be in a pretty good place with our business. So maybe it is fair for us to be 50-50 after that point, even if I were to leave. But maybe we're building something that's going to take a lot of time. A 4-year vesting schedule might be more appropriate, but it's really whatever the parties end up negotiating. Yeah, entrepreneurship is a team sport. I like to say that, even if you're a solo entrepreneur, right? Because you're going to want to have people around your business who are helping you out. It really is impossible to do everything associated with running a business as a single individual, right? Because there's legal needs, there's tax, there's accounting, there's banking. Like, you're going to have people around you even if you're a solo entrepreneur. And if you have co-founders, they're going to be at the table with you as well. And so if you have co-founders, it's important not to be so paralyzed by the idea of like giving away a part of your company to help them, make you successful, that you're sort of stuck trying to do everything on yourself. But it's also important not to go too far in the other direction, right? You don't want to sort of be giving away, I know we're close to Halloween, you don't want to be giving away equity like candy so that you have 100 owners, and that becomes really difficult to manage as well. You want to be smart about who you bring into your business, because you're going to be doing a lot of work, you're going to be spending a lot of time with them, and they really, in the best of times, are going to be your partner over the long term. Yeah, and I like to say, look for co-founders that are batteries, people who energize you, who make you excited to get up in the morning and do what you're going to do, as opposed to vacuums who do quite the opposite. They sort of suck your energy. They make it harder. They're sort of constantly challenging you or criticizing you. Look for people who are going to be your batteries versus your vacuums. Board of directors. So as I mentioned, your stockholders, your owners are going to appoint a board, and you're always going to have a board. Now, you might be the sole member of that board if you're the sole stockholder, but you're still going to be a director. And if you have multiple owners, you're still going to have a board of directors to help manage the governance. Usually, their roles and responsibilities are managing sort of the long-term strategic direction. So most of the time, your board is not going to meet more than once a month. Once you've sort of gotten more established, it'll probably be more on a quarterly basis that they'll meet. But those meetings are really important because that's when you really kind of pull your head out of the day-to-day, right? Pull your head out of the weeds and kind of look more on that long-term strategy and that long-term viability. You say, okay, let's put aside what we're trying to get done before end of day, end of week. Let's think about what we're trying to do for the end of the year, over the next 5 years. Like if you're, when you're meeting with your co-founders, you're probably going to be meeting almost daily at the outset, right? But it's still important to find that time to say, okay, let's have a board meeting. Let's talk about strategy, because that governance piece is really critical. It's important to understand not where you're going just at sort of the tactical day-to-day level. It's important to understand where you're going long-term. Some other common responsibilities of the boards: hiring and firing executives. So again, the CEO, other senior officers tend to report to the board. Reviewing financials. It's important to have that long view when you're thinking about your financial statements, right? You can get really, really wrapped up in kind of money coming in on a particular day, money going out on a particular day, but you want to understand kind of long-term, what does that growth curve look like? And same with the budget, right? Each year, as you get more established and you look back on your historical financials, it's important to budget for what you think the next year should look like, right? So you say, okay, I made $100,000 last year. Based on how we're growing, I think I can, get 150, 200 this year. And then that informs some of the other strategic decisions that you're making, right? Because in order to do that, you have to do certain things. And so that's why sort of that reviewing the financials, reviewing the budget is really important. And that really is kind of the job one of your board of directors. As I mentioned, when you first start, you're probably going to be, everybody around the table as founders and co-founders are going to be your board. Over time, it's important to think about bringing on independent directors, people who are not part of your kind of day-to-day, because they can help provide perspective, right? They're not in the trenches with you, and they can maybe see things that you're a little bit too close to. And then the last point I'd mention, right, is there's something called fiduciary obligations. You may have heard, some financial advisors are fiduciaries. Boards of directors are also fiduciaries. So they stand in a fiduciary relationship to the owners of the company. And so they have an obligation to make decisions after due consideration. That's called a duty of care. And they also have an obligation to not engage in self-dealing, right? So let's say you're loaning the company money. You're on both sides of the table, right? You're a lender on the one hand, and you're a principal in the company on the other. And so it's important to help navigate those conflicts of interest, because that's part of fulfilling your fiduciary duties as a director. Advisors. So advisors are different than directors. They're always going to be folks who are sort of outside of the company, right? If you're a science-based business, you may have a scientific advisory board. If you're sort of technology focused, you maybe have a technology advisory board. Maybe you just have an advisory board. But whether it's sort of formalized as a board or not, you're probably going to have people around you that help guide your decisions, help provide input. It's important whether you formalize it as a board or not to have advisors around you, because there's people who have gone at least a few steps further in most cases than you've gone in your particular enterprise, and they can help, spot issues, spot potential problems. It's important to, again, think of this as a team sport, not try to go it alone. They're really intended to be independent, right? So you want somebody who is going to tell it to you like it is, right? Not somebody who's going to sugarcoat things or just tell you that you're doing a great job, even if you are, right? You want somebody who's going to give you valuable, honest, real feedback. Now, unlike a board of directors, there's not really sort of statutes or laws out there that define what their role should look like. So you have a lot of freedom to define how you want that advisor relationship to look and how formal you want that to be, right? It could just be, look, anytime I call you, you're agreeing to pick up the phone. And maybe I need to talk to you a few times a week. Maybe I won't talk to you again in 6 months, but that's really our arrangement. Maybe it's hey, we're going to sit down with the board every quarter and talk through where we are. Maybe it's just, hey, you're agreeing to meet me for coffee a few times a year. It really can be based on whatever your needs are and how you want that relationship to evolve over time. A lot of flexibility there. It's also important to note that as advisors, they owe no fiduciary obligation to the company, right? So if you enter into a contract with them that says, you're going to meet with us quarterly and they don't, you might have a claim for a breach of that contract, but they don't owe any additional duty to you, right? Like the only duty that they owe is the duty that they agreed by signing a piece of paper. Also, advisors are sometimes, not always, compensated, right? So if you compensate them, you can compensate them with either cash. So I'm going to give you a couple $100s or a couple $1,000 every time you show up, or equity. So you can actually give them a part of your company. Say, hey, I'm going to give you 0.25% of my company in exchange for you agreeing to pick up the phone every time I call. As long as I don't, call your phone every day. Maybe once a quarter, once a month, something like that. So we've talked about stockholders, we've talked about board members, we've talked about advisors. Let's talk about the actual day-to-day management of your company. It's going to start with the officers, the corporate officers. Your senior officers, so CEO, CFO, those are going to be appointed usually by the board, and they're going to be reporting to the board. So if they're not doing a good job, it's the board's responsibility to let them know that. And if it gets to be too big of an issue, maybe find a new CEO. That can be really tricky if the CEO is also a major stockholder, but that is one of the board's responsibilities as well. If you're looking at a Delaware C corporation, you do need to have both a board at the outset and at all times, as well as 2 officers. You need to have both a president and a secretary. You can appoint other officers from time to time, but you always need to have those 2. That's by law. Now, you can also, as your organization grows, you can have other officers like directors of marketing, directors of HR, right? It's important to understand that those members aren't members of the board of directors. They're just officers with a director title in their name. So they're not going to owe those fiduciary duties of duty and care. They are a corporate officer, even though they have the term director as part of their name. You also have sort of vice presidents, senior vice presidents. Those typically report in a certain organizational structure to the president or the CEO rather than reporting to the board directly. So As we mentioned, they're accountable to the board. They manage the day-to-day operations. How do we know what their role is supposed to look like? Well, so for certain senior folks like president, secretary, you can look to the statutes, but by and large, the board and then the senior officers have the flexibility to define what they want the role to look like. Now, this is not an area where we'd encourage you to get very creative. I think most of the time, if you're appointing somebody as a CEO, they should have the roles that a typical CEO has, right? They're sort of responsible for leadership. They're responsible for entering into key contracts, and the buck stops with them, right? If you're the CFO, you're responsible for maintaining the company's books, making sure that your transactions are recorded, making sure that all of that is sort of accurate and clean. If you're the chief scientific officer of, let's say, a biotech company, you're responsible for making sure that the scientific program is moving forward and that the results are accurate and observable and repeatable, right? Compensation, if you're an early stage company, you probably don't have a lot of cash. And so let's say you have a group of founders, maybe 4 of you, but nobody in your group is really, really good at managing money, right? And so doesn't have that sort of accounting background, accounting skill set. So even though your founding team is set, you have a skills gap and you need to bring on somebody else. You can give them a part of your company as well and say, look, I'm going to cut you in for 5%, 10%, whatever the right number is based on your particular situation. And then that way you're able to say, look, I can't pay you in cash what you're worth today, but if you take this ride with us, you'll be getting X% of the profits when we are profitable. And so that can be a really effective tool for getting people on your team, getting people incentivized and aligned with you if you don't have, say, the cash to pay a market salary to somebody just yet. Another thing to note, right, is founders' roles will naturally evolve over the course of the company's life cycle. When you're starting out, if you're a solo founder, you're going to be doing everything yourself. I've often heard that one of the key things to think about as a founder is the best way to give away parts of your job, right? Ideally, you're giving away the parts of your job that you don't like, right? So if you hate doing taxes, you give that away to your accountant. If you are somebody who is really, really good at sales, you're outgoing, you're extroverted, but you really, really don't like going back at the end of the day and looking through reports and financials, you don't like that back office stuff, then find yourself, then you're a salesperson and you should find yourself somebody who's really good at operations to help fill that gap, right? But your role will evolve over time as your organization evolves. And that's a good thing, right? The only constant is change. So a couple key takeaways when we talk about governance. Founders, it's important to know which hat you're wearing when you make a particular decision. And that can be important, that can be really, really important at the outset because, it helps guide your thinking, right? If you're thinking in a more strategic vein, you're probably thinking in your capacity as a board member. If you're thinking about those day-to-day decisions, then you're thinking in your capacity as an officer. If you're thinking about, okay, how can I incentivize people to bring them on as a co-founder, you may be thinking in terms of a founder or a stockholder. But it's important to understand that because it can help guide and clarify your thinking around these particular decisions. You do want to be thoughtful about granting equity. You don't want to give it away like Halloween candy. And it is important to identify and bring on key advisors because nobody's expecting you to do this yourself. It's nearly impossible to do it completely by yourself. And there are people, that's one of the great things, by the way, about this area, is that we're not Silicon Valley, we're not Boston, but I think we have an edge on them in kindness. Not casting stones, not throwing stones on any other region, but just to say that I think we are in particular a very, very willing to help population. So if you go to somebody and you say, hey, look, I'm thinking about starting a business. I have these questions, you know, that person may never see a dime from you, but they're almost certainly willing to point you to somebody who can help, right? That is one of our, I think, true strengths as a region here in RTP is the sort of kindness premium, that kindness edge that we have. Boards of directors, it's important to understand that you do owe fiduciary obligations to the owners, right? And that's all the owners, not just yourself. So if you're a 50-50 owner, you have to think not just what's best for me, you have to think what's best for the whole company. It's important to document key decisions. We didn't really talk about this, but this is critical. Memories fade over time. The best memories still fade over time. And if something doesn't get written down as we decided this on this day, people's memories are going to diverge over time. Well, did we really talk about it that way? I didn't think we really made a final decision. We were just sort of, you know, spitballing, throwing ideas against the wall. I didn't think we really said we were going to go ahead with that. It's important to get those things in writing. And then identifying key outside independent directors, people who you might want to bring onto your formal board who aren't members of the company as well. And then management, understand the scope of your role, understand what you're being tasked with. Again, at the outset, it's probably going to be everything, but be thoughtful about bringing on team members and clearly defining what their roles are and should be, and understand that that role may change and should change over time. So I think we're just at about time, and that is the end of my presentation. We have some time for questions. Any questions?
At what point should you really seek the help of an attorney?
So good question. It's never too early, right? But I think there are certain things that are kind of signs that it's probably time. If you are developing intellectual property, like if you have a patent or something, that's one scenario. If you're starting to deal with the public, I think that's a key area as well, right? So if you have a product or a service and you're starting to offer that product or service to third parties, then it's important to have that liability shield, because even if it's a relatively low risk venture, you're providing certain services as opposed to a product that could, make somebody sick or explode. There's still a risk there because they may think, you didn't provide the service in the way that I thought you were going to. And even though I paid you, I didn't get the full value of what I paid you. So I want part of my money back, and I'm going to chase you for that. It's important to have that company in place so that you have that liability shield so that your personal assets are no longer at risk. Yes.
So, what is the difference? LLC, corporation, and the non-profit, because you didn't talk about it at all.
Good question. So the question is, we talked about corporations, we talked about LLCs. What about nonprofits? So nonprofit is a specific type of corporation as well. It's a nonprofit corporation. There are some key differences. So typically those corporations do not have stockholders. Nonprofit does not have stockholders. They don't technically have owners. They generally do have a board of directors who help manage the company. From a tax standpoint, the biggest difference is you're not going to have people investing in your company and expecting a financial return. You're going to have people donating to your company and then getting a tax deduction for that donation. The other key thing to think about, right, is that you can't, the funds in a nonprofit, because there's no owners, they can't be distributed up to the founders of that nonprofit, right? You have to keep those funds in the business to satisfy the mission of your nonprofit. Now, as an officer of a nonprofit, you can pay yourself a reasonable salary, but if you're taking donations from somebody, you need to be very, very careful about and thoughtful and respectful about how you're spending those funds. So generally speaking, a nonprofit is going to be very mission oriented. You're going to be filling a gap in the market or in society that maybe doesn't have a large financial return, but is still really important. And so that is something that we can help with as well. But it is important to understand, like, if you're a nonprofit, you do have some very real limitations on, what you can do with the funds that are being donated to you. Any other questions? I think 1 and 2.
I write and perform stand-up comedy.
So good question. We didn't really talk about IP, but I do have a separate presentation that focuses on IP for creative works like stand-up comedy, books, songs, theatrical performances, dances. Those are protectable by copyright. So you have what's called copyright protection. One of the nice things about copyright is that they actually the copyright protections attach to that work once it's been reduced to a tangible medium. So once you've sort of written down the stand-up routine, you presented it, you should have your kind of standard copyright protections. There are additional protections you can get by filing them with the US Copyright Office. But I would say most of the time, for most people, the automatic protections are sufficient. So that's one of the nice things about creatives is that they actually get copyright protection automatically.
But the government office has been shut down.
Mhm.
So there is some kind of gap. So what people are shut down.
Well, that's a $1 billion question right there. But but the copyright protections will attach to your creative work automatically, regardless of whether the sort of government is operating or not. So that's because the law is still in place. Fortunately, when the Congress and government isn't running, our laws still apply. So you still get that protection.
Okay, and then when does a copyright become a trademark?
So another good question. A copyright is something that applies to a creative work. A trademark is a logo or a brand, right? So think about things like Coca-Cola, right? The name Coca-Cola and the branding element that you're probably thinking about in your mind, that sort of red circle, that's a trademark. That you do have to file with the US Patent and Trademark Office in order to get protection. So that doesn't apply automatically necessarily, at least not on the federal level. You can have certain limited protections if you don't file, but you typically want to file if you want to try and protect your logo, your name, your brand, prevent anybody else from using it in your same industry. Yeah.
You are writing on the Gen AI use, and a generic question about Gen AI. In what type of legal opinion questions to use Gen AI, and in what type of questions issues speaker-wise of your company?
Yeah, good question. So I'm not the Gen AI guy, so I can speak generally on this, but some really important considerations are: where are you getting your data, the training for the data set? Do you have the right to use that data? Those are really key considerations, right? Because some of these models are trained on sort of publicly available data. Some of these models are trained on proprietary sets of data. And so understanding where that data set is coming from and do you actually have the right to use it is sort of one set of considerations. And that's really on the input side. On the output side, the question is, okay, what are you using your Gen AI for if you're using it internally? Because kind of going back to the IP side of things, courts have generally held that if you use Gen AI to, let's say, generate a picture, you actually don't own that picture, right? There's a legal court case where a I think it was National Geographic photographer put a camera out in the wild somewhere, and a monkey picked it up and took a selfie, right? So the question became, does that photographer own that picture? And the answer that the court came to was actually no, the monkey took the picture, not the photographer, and monkeys can't own property, so nobody owns the picture. And Gen AI is sort of in that same mode. They're basically saying it wasn't you who took that picture or generated that output from the AI. It was the AI that did that, and AI can't own property. So that's the other set of considerations that we often see, is like making sure that if, let's say, you're using Gen AI to write code, you know, are you going to be then going to investors at some later stage and saying that you definitively own that code? Because that can be really tricky, right? So those are some of the things that, you know, sort of we're seeing, we're thinking about. Happy to introduce you to my partner, Lucas Beal, who's kind of the expert on the matter.
What do you advise people to start their company? Chamber of Commerce, or people go to the CPA. CPA will charge you like $3,000. So people go online. I'll follow the procedure. So what do you advise?
Well, so, you know, the reality is some people are going to do it themselves. And maybe if you're the only one involved in your business, that's okay as a step one. I think particularly if you're in that kind of startup mode, you're thinking about doing a high growth startup where you're thinking about taking on outside capital, I think it's probably a good idea to talk to a lawyer. You can talk to a CPA as well. They're, you know, we can both kind of advise on that. You know, generally speaking, I think it doesn't hurt to talk to a lawyer or an accountant when you're thinking about these kind of things, even if, you know, you just have an initial discussion, then you decide, okay, I can at least, you know, I'm kind of the sole person in this. I'm going to set up a single member LLC. So, you know, I think our recommendation as a lawyer is talk to a lawyer. But I also recognize that that doesn't always happen. But there are certain things, hopefully, that now you guys can think about, you know, where it might make sense to talk to a lawyer, like bringing on co-founders, bringing on investors, certainly. Anytime you're engaging with the public, you know, it's important to maybe just have somebody take a look at those documents and make sure that they're doing what you want them to do. Okay, I think we maybe have time for one more question.
About a minute to one. So if anyone's got any questions.
Okay, 1 minute.
Okay, if an LLC is unable to make any profit at the end of the year, is there any tax penalty for that or any source of money?
So I think the question was, if you have an LLC, but there's no profit, you know, what do we do? Is that kind of the question?
Yeah.
You still want to file a tax return. So even if the company is not profitable, you still want to file a tax return for every year that you've been established. It's going to be a very simple tax return because it's going to show, you know, minimal or sometimes no profits, but you still want to talk to an accountant or a CPA and get those tax returns filed. That's really more of an accounting CPA point, but we can certainly point you in the right direction. All right. Well, really appreciate everybody's time, participation, and attention. This was a great audience, so thank you all very much.